6 days before the most important election in Hungary's modern history, something happened that nobody saw coming. Not a scandal, not a poll, not a diplomatic leak, a phone call between Orbán and Fico on a Saturday, 8 days before April 12th, and when they finished talking, they issued a joint demand, directly to Brussels, in writing, with no diplomatic softening, that the European Union immediately lift all sanctions and restrictions on Russian energy imports, not request, demand. Orbán's exact words: "We demand that Brussels immediately suspend the sanctions and restrictions imposed on Russian energy. The European economy is facing a risk of energy shortages and, as a result, rising prices. The threat is imminent." And then Fico went further. He called the European Union, in the week before a critical election, a suicide ship. In matters of energy security, the European Union and the European Commission are starting to look like a suicide ship. 6 days before the election, two leaders most targeted by Brussels in the last 6 weeks, the two men subject to frozen funds, treason charges, wiretapping operations, diplomatic pressure campaigns, and a published 5-step plan for their removal. They picked up the phone on a Saturday, compared notes, and fired a joint demand at the entire European establishment. This is not a defensive move. This is an offensive one. And Brussels, for the first time in this entire confrontation, does not have a ready answer. Because the energy situation in Europe this week is not the same as it was in March. Everything changed, and Orbán and Fico timed their move to the exact moment when the numbers made their argument for them. Here is what mainstream media will not connect. Let's go. To understand the timing, you need to understand what happened to European energy prices in the last 6 weeks. Because the Iran war changed everything. When the United States and Israel began strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure in late February, global oil markets moved immediately. Brent crude briefly crossed $119 per barrel. Iranian attacks on Qatar's Ras Laffan gas facility, the largest in the world, sent gas prices surging. By the time Orbán and Fico made their phone call on April 4th, European energy prices had risen 60% for oil and 70% for gas since the Iran strikes began. The EU's own energy commissioner, Dan Jorgensen, confirmed the numbers publicly. He warned of a possible long-lasting energy shock. He said member states might have to ration fuel. He said the situation was severe. And then, in the same breath, he ruled out easing Russian energy sanctions, 60% oil price rise, 70% gas price rise, potential fuel rationing, and no relief from Russian supply. That is the context in which Orbán and Fico issued their demand. They did not invent the energy crisis. They pointed at it. And they said, "The sanctions are making this worse. Lift them now or we block everything." The timing is not accidental. It is surgical. Because Brussels cannot dismiss an energy argument the week that its own energy commissioner is warning about fuel rationing. The political cost of saying, yes, prices are rising, yes, there may be rationing, and no, we will not touch the sanctions is enormous. And Orbán and Fico just made Brussels pay that cost on the Saturday before the Hungarian election. Now let's look at what blocking everything actually means. Because this is not a rhetorical threat. The €90 billion loan for Ukraine, still blocked. The 20th package of EU sanctions against Russia, still blocked by Hungary and now formally co-blocked by Slovakia. Ukraine's EU accession negotiations, blocked. The Safe Defense Credit Program for Hungary, frozen by Brussels, but Hungary retains veto rights in the Council on everything else. The $360 billion 7-year EU budget. Orbán has threatened to veto the entire framework if it contains Ukraine funding. And now the energy sanctions themselves, the subject of the joint demand. That is 6 separate blocking mechanisms operated simultaneously by 2 countries representing 40 million people, against a union of 450 million. And Brussels cannot activate a single enforcement mechanism against either of them without unanimous agreement from every other member state. Slovakia vetoes Article 7. Slovakia vetoes the removal of Hungary's voting rights. Slovakia vetoes any treaty change to qualified majority voting. And Italy, as we covered in our previous video, privately told 5 diplomatic witnesses at the March summit that it understands Orbán's position. The blocking architecture is intact, and Orbán reinforced it 3 days before April 12th with a joint statement from Bratislava. Now let's talk about what the energy demand specifically asks for, because it is more than just lifting sanctions. Orbán and Fico demanded 3 things in their joint statement. First, immediate suspension of all sanctions and restrictions on Russian oil and gas imports. Second, EU-level initiative to urgently end the war in Ukraine, which, if achieved, would naturally restore supply flows. Third, decisive steps to resume Druzhba pipeline operation. The Druzhba pipeline is still the core. Ukraine says it was damaged by a Russian drone strike. Orbán and Fico say the damage is deliberate Ukrainian sabotage to cut off Central European energy supply for political leverage. An independent EU inspection team was approved, funded, and sent to Kyiv. The inspection has not taken place. Ukraine has not granted security clearance. Zelensky said it himself in March, openly on the record, that he would not repair the pipeline. He said Ukraine had no interest in restoring Russian oil flows to Hungary and Slovakia. He said this while demanding that the EU release 90 billion euros in loans. That sequence. Demand 90 billion, refuse to fix the pipeline, block the inspection, is what Orbán has been pointing at since January. And now, with European gas prices up 70% and the EU Energy Commissioner warning about rationing, the sequence looks different than it did in February. The Energy Commissioner said the sanctions will not be lifted. Brussels' position is unchanged. But the cost of maintaining that position just went from political to material. When ordinary citizens face fuel rationing in Germany, France, Italy, and Poland, the question of why their governments are blocking cheaper Russian supply becomes very difficult to manage. Orbán knows this. Fico knows this. Their Saturday phone call was not diplomacy. It was a calculated escalation at the precise moment when the numbers support the argument. And here is the detail that none of the weekend coverage connected. Orbán made his joint demand with Fico on Saturday, April 4th. He returns to Budapest to vote on Sunday, April 12th. The 8 days between those two events are the most concentrated period of political activity in Hungarian modern history. Rallies, last-minute intelligence claims, final polling pushes, and now a joint energy demand with his Slovak counterpart that puts Brussels on the defensive 1 week before Hungarians enter the polling booth. Every Hungarian voter who heard the Energy Commissioner warn about rationing, and then heard Orbán demand the sanctions be lifted to prevent it, received a clear political message before April 12th. One candidate is trying to fix the energy problem. The other is going to hand control to the people who created it. That is not a coincidence. That is the final move. Now let's look at where Brussels goes from here, because the EU responded to the joint demand, and the response tells you everything about the institution's actual position. The Energy Commissioner ruled out lifting sanctions. Full stop. No negotiations, no flexibility, no acknowledgement that the 60 and 70% price rises might require a policy reassessment. The EU's position is that Russian energy sanctions are non-negotiable regardless of the price impact on European citizens. At the same time, that same commissioner warned that the energy shock could be long-lasting, that fuel rationing might be necessary, that the situation was severe. So the official EU position, stated in the same week by the same official, is the energy crisis is severe and potentially long-lasting, fuel rationing cannot be ruled out, and the sanctions that restrict cheaper energy supply will not be lifted. That is not a policy. That is a contradiction. And Orbán and Fico have just made that contradiction visible to every European voter who pays an energy bill. The EU Energy Commissioner also confirmed a number that had been circulating in energy markets, but not yet officially stated. Since the Iran strikes began, EU gas prices rose 70%. 70% in 6 weeks. That is not a market fluctuation. That is a structural shock. And the two countries with access to cheaper Russian supply, Hungary and Slovakia, through the Druzhba pipeline and their Russian gas contracts, are the only ones in the EU not facing that shock in full. Orbán did not arrange the Iran war. He did not sabotage the pipeline. He did not create the energy crisis. But he positioned Hungary to survive it better than its neighbors. And his joint statement with Fico on April 4th is the moment he made that positioning explicit. In the language of a demand, 1 week before an election. Brussels calls this blackmail. And from Brussels' perspective, it is. Two member states are conditioning their participation in shared mechanisms on the outcome they want on a separate question. But from Budapest and Bratislava's perspective, and increasingly from Rome's perspective, and from the perspective of every European family facing a fuel bill 70% higher than it was in February, the question is different. The question is, who is making decisions that affect your energy costs? And are they making them for your benefit or for someone else's? Orbán's answer to that question has been consistent for 15 years. Brussels makes decisions for an ideological agenda that does not account for Central European energy reality. His government makes decisions for Hungarian citizens who need affordable energy. And his joint statement with Fico on April 4th is the clearest version of that answer he has ever delivered. At the highest possible political moment, with maximum visibility, with a Slovak co-signatory who faces the same treason charges for the same positions. The EU called it a suicide ship. Fico said it first, but the phrase is doing something specific. It is not describing a ship that crashed. It is describing a ship that is choosing to crash, with the crew insisting the course is correct even as the hull fills with water. That is Fico's accusation against Brussels. And he made it 8 days before the Hungarian election, in coordination with the man Brussels has been trying to remove for 3 years. 6 days to April 12th. The final move is on the board. Brussels has no answer to the energy numbers. And the energy numbers are not going down before Sunday. Subscribe. Whatever happens on April 12th, the energy story does not end there. The pipeline is still broken. The sanctions are still in place. The prices are still rising. And the two men who built this position are still standing. This channel will be here for all of it. And here is one more number to carry into April 12th. The EU Energy Commissioner confirmed that since the Iran strikes began, oil prices in Europe rose 60%. Gas prices rose 70%. The EU is now discussing fuel rationing as a realistic policy option for member states. Hungary and Slovakia have Russian energy contracts. They have the Druzhba pipeline. Broken but repairable. They have Russian gas flowing through alternative routes. And they have a joint statement from their prime ministers demanding that Brussels stop blocking the cheaper supply. Every German, French, Italian, and Polish citizen paying a 70% higher gas bill this month is living the consequence of a sanctions policy that two governments told Brussels was unsustainable. Those two governments were dismissed, pressured, charged with treason, had their funds frozen, had their defense credits blocked, and had their foreign ministers wiretapped. And they were right about the energy numbers. That does not make every position Orbán or Fico holds correct. It makes the energy argument correct. And, in politics, being right about the thing that hits people's wallets is worth more than being right about anything else. Brussels has 6 days to answer the joint demand. It will not lift the sanctions. The Energy Commissioner already said so. Which means that, by the time Hungarian voters walk into polling booths on April 12th, the EU's answer to the energy crisis will be no relief, no flexibility, no acknowledgement that the policy has a cost. Orbán built his entire campaign on that answer. And Fico handed him one final piece of ammunition on the Saturday before the vote. The final move is on the board. 6 days to go. Subscribe. Because this story does not end on April 12th. It only enters its next phase.